The night the Duke of Kent whispered, "Oh God, why her?" a silence fell over the royal family that words could barely contain. This was not just a passing sorrow, not just the quiet death of an elderly duchess at the respectable age of 92. This was the breaking of a bond that had endured decades of hidden illness, unspoken pain, private sacrifices, and the kind of love that rarely makes it into glossy royal portraits. The Duchess of Kent, Catherine, had been the quiet, almost invisible pillar behind the Duke for over half a century. And now, she was gone. But how did it come to this moment? How did a woman born into aristocratic privilege, drawn into royal duty, end up living a life marked not by luxury, but by relentless battles with depression, Epstein-Barr virus, and celiac disease? And why, even after years of retreat from public life, does her death strike such a haunting chord today? Think about it. Royal deaths are not unusual. The press has documented them for centuries. Yet this one carries a different weight. Why? Because Catherine, Duchess of Kent, never fit neatly into the image the monarchy wanted to project. She wasn't a tabloid queen. She wasn't a dramatic scandal maker. She wasn't the glamour princess adored by millions. Instead, she was something rarer. She was human in a world that demanded perfection. She carried illnesses that no crown could protect her from. She lived through depression at a time when the royal family pretended mental health struggles didn't exist. And she dared to live privately, even humbly, when her title gave her the power to dominate headlines. That contradiction is what makes this story matter now. In an era when the monarchy fights to remain relevant, Catherine's life and death reveal something much deeper than royal ceremony. They reveal fragility, resilience, and the unbearable cost of silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being in his shoes. The Duke of Kent has been by the Queen's side for decades, appearing at Trooping the Color, state ceremonies, and diplomatic events. He stood in the shadow of duty, a figure the public barely noticed, but one the monarchy could not do without. Yet behind the scenes, he returned home to a wife who was fighting for her life in ways the cameras would never see. That's the great irony here. The public always believed royals lived charmed lives of luxury, but Catherine's story proves that titles cannot shield anyone from human suffering. The Duke lived a double life, public duty by day, private despair by night. And it was this hidden duality that made his final goodbye so unbearably raw. Now, let's pull back the curtain on Catherine herself. For most people, her name barely registers compared to Diana, Kate, or Meghan. But Catherine was no less remarkable. Born into privilege, she could have embraced the life of a socialite, drifting from one glittering ball to the next. Instead, she chose duty, loyalty, and, eventually, self-imposed humility. Yet the tragedies she faced behind palace walls told a different story. Depression stalked her from early adulthood. Epstein-Barr virus sapped her energy, turning her into a prisoner of fatigue. Celiac disease forced her into painful restrictions long before gluten-free diets became mainstream. How many times did she sit at a royal banquet surrounded by dishes she could not touch? How many times did she smile for cameras while hiding the exhaustion that made every step feel like climbing a mountain? Can you imagine the cruelty of that irony, being the Duchess of Kent, but unable to live like one? And still, she endured. "None of us goes through life unscathed," she once said, almost as if summing up her existence in a single phrase. Those words echo louder now, in the shadow of her death. Because they weren't just words. They were a quiet act of rebellion against the monarchy's polished facade. Royals are supposed to look perfect, untouchable, unbothered. Yet here was a duchess admitting weakness, vulnerability, and scars. Doesn't that honesty cut deeper than any gilded crown? Doesn't it make you wonder how many others inside those palace walls are carrying burdens we will never know? This is why her death matters. Because her story shatters the myth that royalty equals immunity. Her life reminds us that behind every tiara is a person, and behind every photograph is a private struggle we cannot see. And when the Duke of Kent finally broke down with the words, "Oh God, why her?" he wasn't just mourning the loss of a wife. He was mourning decades of sacrifice, hers and his. He was mourning the battles fought in silence, the dinners abandoned, the public appearances endured while she suffered in bed. He was mourning the cost of being royal in a world that does not forgive imperfection. But let's ask the uncomfortable question. Why now? Why does her story hit with such intensity at this moment in history? Perhaps because the monarchy itself is under a microscope like never before. With the Queen gone, with Charles fighting for acceptance, with William and Harry dividing public opinion, the royal family is fragile. And in the middle of this fragility comes the story of Catherine, a duchess who lived quietly, without scandal, but who still could not escape tragedy. Doesn't that contrast with the noise of today's royals? Doesn't it make us pause and reconsider who really carried the burdens with dignity? Her death at 92 could have been a footnote. Instead, it has become a mirror held up to the monarchy and to us. Because whether you're royal or not, you cannot escape illness. You cannot escape depression. You cannot escape loss. And that's why this story connects so deeply. It is not just about a duchess. It is about all of us. It is about the inevitability of grief, the hidden battles we fight, and the fragility of love in the face of mortality. Still, the question lingers. What exactly did the Duke mean when he said, "Oh God, why her?" Was it simply the outburst of a grieving husband? Or was it the release of decades of suppressed sorrow, all the words left unsaid? Was it the guilt of duty pulling him one way while her suffering pulled him another? Or was it something even more shocking, something tied to secrets the royal family has never dared to reveal? That's where this story takes a darker turn. Because Catherine's life, for all its humility, was not without mystery. The illnesses that plagued her were only one part of the story. Her withdrawal from royal duties, her decision to live quietly as Mrs. Kent while teaching music, her near invisibility in public life. These choices baffled royal watchers for decades. Why did she step back so drastically? Why did she embrace anonymity in a family obsessed with image? And most importantly, what did she know, what did she carry, that still remains unsaid even in death? The truth is, Catherine's life cannot be told in simple terms of illness and devotion. There are hidden corners, unanswered questions, and contradictions that the palace never wanted exposed. And as we step into those corners, as we peel back the layers of her story, we begin to see why the Duke's final words carry a weight far heavier than grief alone. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. He first saw her not under the blinding lights of Buckingham Palace or in the stiff formality of a state dinner, but in the understated circles of Britain's aristocracy. The Duke of Kent, Prince Edward, was no stranger to duty, prestige, and the crushing weight of royal expectations. But Catherine Worsley, the woman who would one day become his duchess, was something different. She was elegant, yes. Refined, certainly. But she carried with her a warmth that seemed to stand in direct opposition to the cold marble corridors of royal life. Their meeting wasn't staged for cameras, nor was it scripted for political convenience. It was a genuine encounter, and in that authenticity, something rare sparked. Can you picture it? A young duke, raised in the gilded cage of Windsor duty, falling for a woman whose charm lay not in scandal or spectacle, but in her quiet dignity. In a world where marriages were often arranged with calculation, Catherine and Edward's connection felt startlingly human. It was a love story born not of obligation but of choice, and that, in itself, was almost revolutionary in the royal family of their time. But let's be clear, their romance was not some fairy tale that unfolded effortlessly. Royal romances rarely are. The glare of the monarchy magnifies everything, every flaw, every doubt, every whisper of disapproval. Edward was a first cousin to the Queen. His every move was subject to scrutiny. Marrying Catherine meant not just a wedding. It meant introducing her into the intricate machinery of an institution obsessed with image. Did the monarchy see her as suitable? Did the courtiers quietly raise their eyebrows? These questions lingered in the air, even as Edward pursued the woman he adored. Still, love persevered. In 1961, their engagement was announced. The press celebrated, the nation swooned, and the monarchy breathed easier knowing one of its senior members had secured a respectable match. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form, not in their love, but in the fragile reality of Catherine's health and temperament. She was about to step into one of the most relentless roles imaginable, the wife of a royal duke. And while she would wear the title with grace, Her body and mind were preparing for battles that no tiara could shield her from. Their wedding was a grand affair, as royal weddings tend to be. Crowds gathered, cameras flashed, and Britain watched as Catherine Worsley became the Duchess of Kent. To the public, it was a storybook moment. A radiant bride, a dignified groom, a happy ending sealed with vows. But was it really an ending? Or was it the beginning of a story that would soon twist into something far darker? Think about it. The Duchess, smiling before the cameras, looked every bit the image of royal perfection. Yet, even then, whispers of her vulnerability hovered in the background. Those closest to her sensed it, the fragility, the quiet shadow of melancholy that followed her. Was it nerves? Was it the daunting responsibility of joining the monarchy? Or was it something deeper, something rooted in the depression that would come to define much of her private life? The public never saw it. The monarchy never acknowledged it. But Edward did. He had glimpsed her pain, and in marrying her, he had taken it upon himself to protect her from a world that demanded more than she could ever give. Their early years together carried the veneer of royal normalcy. Appearances at state events, smiling family photographs, glimpses of a couple who seemed, at least on the surface, to embody stability. But the reality was more complicated. Catherine was no Diana, adored by millions. She wasn't Kate, praised for her poise. She wasn't Meghan, sparking global debates. Catherine was quieter, more withdrawn, more human in her flaws. And that humanity didn't fit the monarchy's polished script. Audience, let me ask you this. How would you cope if every weakness, every illness, every whisper of sadness had to be hidden behind a mask of grace? Could you do it? Could you stand in front of flashing cameras while your body trembled with exhaustion? Could you shake hands and smile while inside your chest, despair pressed down like a weight? That was Catherine's life. That was her reality. And Edward, her husband, the Duke of Kent, was forced to navigate the impossible divide between the duties expected of him and the love he bore for his fragile wife. Their love was real, yes, but it was love tested in the crucible of duty, and the cracks would only grow wider as Catherine's illnesses emerged, one by one, chipping away at her public role. Depression was the first to come knocking, pulling her into darkness that royal tradition refused to acknowledge. Later, Epstein-Barr virus would ravage her body, leaving her drained and defeated. And then came celiac disease, a cruel twist of fate that isolated her further. Each illness built another wall between her and the world, between her and the duties she was expected to fulfill. And Edward? He bore it silently. To the public, he was steady, dependable, loyal to the Queen. Behind closed doors, he was a husband watching his wife suffer. He carried both roles with dignity, but the weight was unbearable. How many times did he return from a royal engagement to find her in bed, too weak to rise? How many times did he sit in silence, unsure of how to ease the invisible pain of her depression? These are the moments history rarely records, the human moments that no official biography will ever capture. Yet they are the moments that define a marriage more than any public ceremony ever could. It was this love, this unspoken loyalty, that made his final words so haunting. "Oh God, why her?" Those weren't just words of grief. They were the culmination of decades spent watching her fight battles that most of the world never knew about. They were the release of a man who had lived two lives, one of public duty and one of private despair. But before we get to that heartbreaking goodbye, we must first understand the depths of Catherine's suffering. Depression, Epstein-Barr, celiac disease. Each played a role in shaping her story. Each carved scars into her life that the public rarely saw. And each tested their marriage in ways unimaginable. And yet, here's the twist. Catherine did not let these illnesses define her entirely. She made choices that shocked the royal family, choices that set her apart from the tradition-bound monarchy, choices that would ultimately shape her legacy in ways no illness could erase. But what were those choices? And why did they leave the palace whispering for decades? Because what came next would reveal the hidden strength of the Duchess of Kent, and the price she paid for living authentically in a world built on appearances. She once said, almost in passing, "None of us goes through life unscathed." To the casual ear, it sounded like a throwaway remark. Polite, philosophical, almost rehearsed. But those words carried the weight of her existence. Because the Duchess of Kent did not glide through royal life untouched by sorrow. She carried shadows. And the first of those shadows, one that would trail her for decades, was depression. Now, pause for a moment and think about the era she lived in. The 1960s. The royal family was at the height of its mystique. Stiff upper lip wasn't just a phrase, it was law. Royals didn't admit to weakness. Royals didn't falter. Royals didn't confess to invisible battles of the mind. They smiled, they waved, they endured. Behind palace gates, silence reigned supreme. And yet, Catherine Worsley, newly married into the firm, found herself caught in a storm that no crown, no title, no husband could shield her from. Depression. Imagine the crushing isolation of it. You're in Kensington Palace or York House, surrounded by staff, formality, gilded halls. Yet you feel utterly alone. A duchess, yes, but a duchess battling an illness so misunderstood, it was often dismissed as weakness. Can you imagine what it must have been like? Waking up with no energy to rise from bed, yet knowing you were expected to stand beside the Queen at public ceremonies? Smiling for cameras while inside, a fog of despair consumed you? Every laugh, every handshake, every curtsy became an act, and every act chipped away at her strength. For Catherine, this was not occasional sadness. This was clinical, unrelenting depression. And the cruelest part? She could not speak about it. There was no therapy for royal duchesses. No sympathetic tabloids writing about mental health awareness. No supportive initiatives from the palace. Instead, there was silence. Iron silence. The kind that isolates you further because you are forced to wear a mask every waking moment. And Edward, the Duke, what about him? He saw it. He felt it. He knew his wife was drowning. But what could he do? A royal husband, bound by the same traditions of silence, unable to speak openly even to his closest family members. He stood by her, yes. But how many nights did he sit alone, wondering why his love wasn't enough to lift her out of despair? How many times did he leave her side for a royal duty, knowing full well she was curled in bed, broken, and unable to follow? Can you feel the weight of that guilt? The irony here is stark. Royals were expected to embody perfection, grace, composure, dignity. And yet, Catherine's depression was eating away at her ability to perform those very roles. She didn't want the cameras. She didn't crave the spotlight. Unlike Diana years later, Catherine was not a media darling. She wasn't adored worldwide. She slipped into the shadows willingly, because the shadows felt safer than the glare. But was it choice, or was it necessity? That question haunts her story. Let's ask you directly. If you were Catherine, would you have spoken up? Could you have risked the ridicule, the whispers of weakness, the cold stares of courtiers who might have labeled you unfit for duty? Or would you have done what she did, smile for the photographs, wave for the crowd, and then retreat into silence when the doors closed? This silence had consequences. Depression is an illness that thrives in secrecy. It grows heavier when hidden. And so Catherine's isolation deepened. There are accounts of her disappearing for long stretches from royal life, quietly avoiding the scrutiny of the press. The tabloids speculated. Was she ill? Was there scandal? Was the marriage strained? No one outside the palace walls truly knew the depth of her battle. And that mystery, those unexplained absences, only fueled the whispers. But here's the contradiction that makes Catherine so fascinating. For all her struggles, she was not weak. She was not fragile in the way some might imagine. She endured. She survived. She pushed through decades of expectations, even when her mind betrayed her. That is strength of a different kind, silent strength. The kind the monarchy doesn't put on display, but the kind that matters most. Edward knew this, and it's part of why his grief at her passing was so devastating. He had lived beside a woman who fought battles unseen, who smiled through despair, who endured a lifetime of illness with dignity. His, "Oh God, why her?" wasn't just about death. It was about the unfairness of it all. Why her? Why the woman who had already carried more suffering than anyone should? But Catherine's depression was only the first of her invisible enemies. Depression carved away at her spirit, yes, but then came another foe. One that attacked her body, drained her energy, and left her imprisoned by exhaustion. Epstein-Barr virus. A condition few understood then, and even fewer respected. And it was this second shadow that would change her life in ways no one in the royal family could ignore. Because what came next was not just another illness. It was a battle that forced her further into seclusion and brought new cracks into the facade of royal perfection. It began as fatigue, not the ordinary tiredness you and I might feel after a long day, but something deeper, something that seeped into her bones and refused to let go. At first, those around her thought it was just stress. After all, life inside the monarchy is a marathon of duties, appearances, and expectations. But for Catherine, the Duchess of Kent, this wasn't stress. It wasn't nerves. It was something far more insidious, Epstein-Barr virus. Now, let's be clear, Epstein-Barr isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a virus that, in many people, can trigger mononucleosis. But in some cases, Catherine's case, it doesn't go away. It lingers, it festers, it morphs into a chronic condition that mimics what we now call chronic fatigue syndrome. Can you imagine living with that? Waking up every morning feeling as if you hadn't slept at all? Muscles aching, brain fog clouding your thoughts, the simplest tasks feeling like mountains? For a duchess, whose very life was supposed to be a performance, this was devastating. Picture it, the palace calendar packed with events, garden parties, trooping the color, state banquets, charity visits, all of them requiring Catherine's presence, her smile, her energy. But what if your body won't cooperate? What if standing for half an hour feels like running a marathon? What if dressing in silks and jewels feels like putting on a costume you no longer have the strength to wear? That was her reality. And here's the cruel irony. Epstein-Barr is invisible. Unlike a broken leg or a visible wound, it leaves no obvious scars. To the outside world, Catherine looked perfectly fine. A radiant duchess, impeccably dressed, smiling for the cameras. But inside, she was collapsing. The virus stripped her of vitality, stole her independence, and forced her to retreat further into the shadows. Doesn't that strike you as the most isolating fate of all, to look perfectly healthy while your body is waging a silent war? Even within the royal family, there was little understanding. Chronic fatigue was not a recognized condition in those days. Many dismissed it as laziness, weakness, or even imagination. Can you see how cruel that must have felt? Imagine confiding in someone, saying, "I can't get out of bed, I can't keep my eyes open, I feel like I'm drowning in exhaustion," only to be met with skepticism. For Catherine, this wasn't just an illness, it was a double punishment. Her body failed her, and society doubted her. And what of Edward, her husband, the Duke of Kent? Again, he faced the impossible. Duty demanded his presence at the Queen's side, at military events, at countless functions. But home was where his true battle lay. He saw his wife's exhaustion. He saw her struggle to rise from bed. He watched her cancel appearances at the last minute, leaving courtiers scrambling to cover for her absence. To the outside world, it looked like a duchess retreating. To Edward, it was the woman he loved being eaten alive by an invisible disease. Let me ask you directly. If you were Catherine, would you have chosen to push through? Would you have plastered on a smile and forced yourself into the public eye, no matter the cost to your body? Or would you have done what she ultimately did? Pull back, retreat, shield yourself from a world that refused to understand? Because retreat is exactly what she chose. The Epstein-Barr virus forced Catherine to give up much of her public role. It wasn't a dramatic abdication, not a scandal splashed across front pages. It was quieter than that. Slowly, her name appeared less and less on the court circular. Slowly, her image vanished from the papers. Slowly, she became a shadow duchess, present in title, absent in body. And the whispers began. The media speculated. Was she simply shy? Was her marriage strained? Was there some secret the palace was hiding? The truth was far more human. She was sick. She was tired. She was barely surviving. But because the royal family never acknowledged the reality of chronic illness, those rumors took on a life of their own. Catherine suffered twice. First from her condition, and then from the cruel judgment of those who assumed she had simply abandoned her duties. Here's where Catherine's story takes an extraordinary turn. Instead of clinging desperately to royal appearances, she began to embrace anonymity. She found purpose in places no one expected. Later in life, she would go so far as to teach music to children who had no idea their humble instructor was a duchess. But that decision, the choice to step back, to live as Catherine rather than Her Royal Highness, can be traced back to these years. Epstein-Barr broke her down. but it also gave her clarity. Clarity about what mattered most. And yet, even as she rebuilt her private life, the illness continued its relentless grip. Think of the cruelty. One condition might have been bearable. Depression was already a shadow. But now fatigue layered itself on top of despair, trapping her in a cycle of exhaustion that must have felt impossible to escape. And as if fate hadn't punished her enough, another diagnosis loomed on the horizon. Because Epstein-Barr was not the end of her suffering. It was only the middle chapter. The next enemy was cruel in its own right, forcing her to navigate a life where even food, the most basic of pleasures, became dangerous. And it was this battle with celiac disease that would reveal the deepest irony of her existence. A duchess surrounded by royal feasts, unable to eat at the king's table. Imagine being seated at a glittering royal banquet. The table stretches endlessly, laden with silver platters, crystal glasses, and golden candelabras. Dishes parade in one after another. Roast pheasant, buttery pastries, delicate tarts, freshly baked breads glistening with glaze. The scent alone is intoxicating. For most, this is indulgence, privilege, and luxury. But for the Duchess of Kent, Catherine, it was torment. Because hidden beneath the glamour was her invisible adversary, celiac disease. Celiac isn't simply being sensitive to bread. It is an autoimmune condition where even the smallest trace of gluten can trigger agony. Stomach cramps that double you over. Nausea that lingers for hours. A fatigue so profound it feels like your body is betraying you. And worse, it can lead to long-term complications that steal vitality day by day. Now, put that reality into the life of a royal duchess, where nearly every public duty revolved around food, wine, and ceremony. Can you begin to see the cruelty of it? Catherine's celiac diagnosis came in an era when the condition was barely understood. Gluten-free diets weren't mainstream. Restaurants didn't have special menus. Even doctors sometimes dismissed it as fussiness or psychosomatic. But this was real. For Catherine, every plate placed before her was a gamble. Every sip of sauce-laden dish carried risk. At family dinners, she had to quietly avoid certain foods, sometimes feigning politeness to avoid attention. At state banquets, where hundreds of eyes watched, she faced the humiliating reality of turning down dishes most would kill to taste. Let's pause here. How would you have handled it? If you were Catherine, would you have dared to explain? Would you have leaned across the table and said, "I can't eat this, it will make me sick"? Or would you have done what she did, smile faintly, pick at the edges of a plate, and pray no one noticed? That's the thing about celiac disease. It forces you into secrecy. And secrecy was already the currency of the monarchy. This condition further isolated her. Already battling depression and Epstein-Barr, Catherine now had food, the most basic act of living, turned into a source of anxiety. Can you imagine the weight of that? Meals, once a place of laughter and family connection, became battlefields. And in royal life, those battlefields were constant. Lunch with diplomats, dinners with foreign leaders, garden parties where cakes and pastries were paraded as symbols of British culture. Catherine lived in the heart of abundance, but could not partake. Doesn't that strike you as one of the bitterest ironies imaginable? And the whispers grew louder. The Duchess was often absent. When she did appear, she seemed withdrawn, frail. Rumors of her health circulated, but rarely did the full truth emerge. Celiac disease simply wasn't part of the public conversation then. And so, people speculated. Was she anorexic? Was she simply odd? Was her marriage faltering? These cruel misunderstandings only deepened her pain. But here's what sets Catherine apart. She didn't wallow in self-pity. She adapted. Quietly, privately, she learned how to manage her condition. Special meals were prepared discreetly. She became disciplined, almost monk-like, in controlling what she ate. But that discipline came at a cost. It drew another line between her and the rest of the royal family. At dinners, while others toasted and feasted, she navigated with caution, her plate different, her glass different, her life different. And Edward, the Duke, what of him? He understood. He supported. But he, too, must have felt the sting of awkwardness. Imagine sitting beside your wife as she turns down dish after dish at a royal banquet. Imagine the whispers. Is something wrong with the Duchess? Is she unwell? Is she being difficult? He bore those whispers silently, never betraying her struggles. His loyalty, his love, meant shielding her from criticism even when it fell on them both. And yet, deep down, the helplessness must have gnawed at him. How do you protect someone from an illness that never lets up? There's another layer here, a symbolic one. Food has always been a unifying force. Families gather around tables. Nations seal alliances with meals. Royals, in particular, use banquets to project power, wealth, and tradition. And yet, Catherine's celiac disease turned that symbol into exclusion. She wasn't part of the ritual in the same way. She was set apart. In a monarchy obsessed with unity and sameness, she was different. And difference, in the royal family, often comes at a high price. But here's where Catherine showed remarkable resilience. Instead of allowing her condition to define her as fragile or broken, she channeled her energy elsewhere. She shifted focus from what she couldn't do to what she could. And this pivot, this decision to step back from the banquet tables and step into a different role, shaped the next phase of her life. A phase where she shocked the palace, defied expectations, and redefined what it meant to be a duchess. Because Catherine would eventually step away from royal life, retreating from the public eye. At first, her illnesses were the excuse. Depression, Epstein-Barr, celiac, all valid, all real. But her retreat was more than survival. It was choice. And that choice was radical in a family that demanded total devotion to duty. The truth? Her illnesses gave her cover to live the life she wanted. A quieter life. A life away from pomp and spectacle. A life where she could rediscover herself not as a duchess, but as Catherine. But that decision came at a cost to her image, her reputation, and perhaps even her marriage. So why did she do it? Why risk the whispers, the judgment, the palace disapproval? Why choose retreat when others fought for visibility? Because what Catherine did next would astonish even those closest to her, and change the way history would remember the Duchess of Kent. There came a moment when the Duchess of Kent simply said, enough. Enough of the relentless expectations. Enough of pretending her body wasn't betraying her. Enough of forcing herself into gowns, jewels, and ceremonies when all she wanted was peace. And in that moment, Catherine did something almost unheard of in the royal family. She stepped away. Think about what that really means. Royals don't retire. Royals don't resign. Royals serve until their dying breath, bound by duty, tradition, and the watchful eye of history. But Catherine broke that unwritten rule. She did not storm out in scandal, like later figures we know too well. She didn't give a televised interview. She didn't write a tell-all memoir. She simply faded, gracefully, deliberately, quietly. A duchess withdrawing into the shadows, leaving behind the grand stage of the monarchy. Doesn't that strike you as shocking in its own subtle way? Of course, the palace never issued statements explaining it. The monarchy doesn't do explanations. They do silence. And that silence gave birth to speculation. Was Catherine too ill to continue? Was her marriage unraveling? Was she being punished by the firm? The tabloids filled the gaps with theories. But the truth was both simpler and more profound. Catherine wanted out, not of the marriage, not of her family, but out of the endless cycle of public scrutiny. Illness gave her the justification. Her soul gave her the push. Now picture the courage this required. She wasn't Diana, adored by millions who would defend her every choice. She wasn't Meghan, with media platforms ready to amplify her voice. Catherine didn't have public sympathy or modern advocacy on her side. In fact, most people barely noticed her. And yet, she risked being labeled fragile, reclusive, even unstable, all to preserve her sanity. Doesn't that kind of quiet defiance deserve more respect than it's ever been given? But here's the twist. The royal family didn't stop her. Why? Maybe because they, too, saw the toll illness had taken. Maybe because Catherine never framed her withdrawal as rebellion, only necessity. Maybe because, unlike others who rocked the monarchy with drama, she chose discretion. Whatever the reason, Catherine became one of the only royals in modern history to deliberately slip away from the spotlight without scandal. And what did she do with this newfound freedom? This is where Catherine's story takes a surprising turn. While the world assumed she had vanished into aristocratic obscurity, she began living a life more authentic than perhaps any duchess before her. She pursued music, her passion since girlhood. She spent time teaching children, introducing them to instruments, helping them discover joy in melodies. Imagine being a student, thinking your music teacher was just a kind older woman, only to learn later that she was, in fact, the Duchess of Kent. That humility was staggering. A duchess, a member of one of the most powerful families in the world, choosing anonymity to give back to children who didn't even know her title. And yet, the palace was not entirely comfortable with this. Royals are supposed to serve the crown first. Their identities are tied to their titles. Catherine blurred those lines. She sometimes asked to be addressed as Mrs. Kent in her teaching life, a quiet rebellion against the weight of formality. Doesn't that make you wonder, was she happier as Mrs. Kent than as the Duchess of Kent? Did she, in stepping away, finally find the freedom she had been denied inside those palace walls? But let's not romanticize it too much. Stepping back came with costs. She missed key royal events. Her absences fueled whispers. Some courtiers likely saw her as unreliable. To the press, she became a mystery, neither a scandal nor a spectacle, just a question mark. And for Edward, the Duke, this created a strange duality. At public events, he often stood alone, the empty space beside him glaring in photographs. How many times did he feel the sting of that absence? How many times did he wish she could be there, not just for appearances, but because she was his partner, his love? Yet Edward supported her. He always did. And perhaps that's why their marriage endured when others cracked under less strain. He understood that her choice wasn't abandonment. It was survival. And in his loyalty, he proved something rare. That even in the monarchy, love can outweigh duty. Now, let me ask you, if you were Catherine, would you have made the same choice? Would you have risked your reputation, your place in the public eye, your standing in history, just for peace of mind? Or would you have soldiered on, sacrificing your health for appearances? Catherine chose peace. And in doing so, she left behind a question that haunts the royal family even now. What if more royals were allowed to be human? But stepping away wasn't the end of her story. In fact, it opened the door to something extraordinary. Catherine's retreat from the spotlight didn't make her smaller. It made her legacy richer. Because away from the palace, she discovered her truest passion, the one thing that gave her life meaning when illness and depression tried to strip it away. And that passion? It wasn't crowns or ceremonies. It was music. Because what Catherine did next, in her quiet, unroyal life, would astonish the world and redefine what it truly meant to be a duchess. Music had always been there for her. Long before the palace doors closed around her, long before the tiaras and the titles, Catherine Worsley found solace in melody. As a young girl, she played piano, listened to choirs, and felt something stir within her that words could never capture. And when her body betrayed her, when depression dragged her down, when Epstein-Barr left her bedridden, when celiac disease robbed her of life's simplest pleasures, music remained her constant refuge. It was her sanctuary. It was her rebellion. And, in time, it became her legacy. Now, imagine this for a moment. A duchess, born into aristocracy, married into royalty, could have lived her life in gilded halls, surrounded by servants and ceremony. Yet what did she choose? Not another royal cause. Not a patronage that existed only on paper. She chose to teach music. To children. Ordinary children. Children who had no idea their humble instructor was, in fact, a member of the royal family. She sat with them, one by one, guiding small fingers across piano keys, coaxing them to find rhythm, to feel joy, to discover themselves in sound. Can you see the irony? A duchess finding freedom not in Buckingham Palace, but in a classroom, disguised as simply Mrs. Kent. And yes, that is what she often asked to be called, Mrs. Kent. Not Her Royal Highness. Not Your Grace. Just Mrs. Kent. Doesn't that strike you as remarkable? Royals cling to titles. They live and breathe status. But Catherine discarded hers in the most understated way. She wanted her students to see her not as a duchess, but as a woman, as a teacher, as someone who cared. Isn't that more radical than any headline-grabbing rebellion we've seen from the monarchy? Let me ask you directly. What would you think if your child came home one day and said, "My music teacher is the Duchess of Kent"? Would you believe them? Or would you laugh, dismiss it as childish imagination? That's how quietly Catherine lived. So quietly that those closest to her students often had no idea who she really was. And yet, in that anonymity, she found the authenticity that royal life denied her. But this wasn't just a hobby. Catherine's devotion to music shaped her very identity. She championed music education, worked with choirs, and supported programs that gave opportunities to those who might otherwise never touch an instrument. Music, to her, wasn't elitist. It wasn't about prestige. It was about healing, and perhaps that's the key to understanding her. Music had healed her in moments of despair. Now she was passing that healing on to others. Think of the irony here. Royals are known for charities, yes, but often their involvement is symbolic. Ribbon cuttings, speeches, smiles for cameras. But Catherine was different. She rolled up her sleeves. She gave her time. She gave her heart. She wasn't a figurehead. She was a participant. She lived her work, not for publicity, but for passion. Doesn't that make her more admirable than many who came after her? And Edward, the Duke, what did he think of all this? Imagine his perspective. His wife, once expected to stand beside him at glittering ceremonies, was now slipping into schoolrooms, teaching music to children under the name Mrs. Kent. To some, it might have seemed unbecoming of a duchess. But Edward supported her. Because he knew the truth, this wasn't unbecoming at all. It was liberating. It was Catherine's way of surviving. And in a way, it made her more of a duchess than any crown ever could. But let's not overlook the risks. Her choice baffled the palace. Quietly, behind closed doors, there were likely raised eyebrows. Why is the Duchess of Kent teaching? Why is she rejecting her title in public spaces? The monarchy doesn't like unpredictability. They don't like individuality that challenges the image. And Catherine, by living authentically, did just that. Not with fanfare, not with interviews, not with dramatic exits, but with something far more unsettling to the firm. Quiet defiance. And yet, despite the whispers, she carried on. She found fulfillment in music, in teaching, in humility. For Catherine, this was not a side project. It was her truest self. In the grand narrative of the monarchy, her story may seem small, overshadowed by scandal and spectacle. But make no mistake, her devotion to music is a legacy that outlives her illnesses, outshines the whispers, and redefines what it means to serve. But here's the question that lingers. Did the royal family ever truly understand her choice? Did they see her teaching as noble, or did they see it as eccentricity? Did they value her quiet contributions, or did they dismiss them as a duchess gone rogue in her own peculiar way? Because here lies the contradiction. Catherine gave more in her anonymity than many royals gave in their fame. And yet, she remained largely forgotten by history until her death brought her name back into the headlines. Doesn't that reveal something uncomfortable about how we measure legacy? We celebrate drama, but we overlook dignity. Still, music sustained her. It gave her purpose when illness tried to rob her of everything. It gave her an identity beyond duchess, beyond title, beyond expectation. And most importantly, it gave her students something priceless, the memory of a kind woman who believed in them, long before they knew she was royalty. But while music gave Catherine a sanctuary, it could not erase the strain her withdrawal placed on her marriage. For every classroom she walked into, there was a banquet hall she walked away from. For every child she taught, there was a public engagement she declined. And that absence, the absence of a duchess at her duke's side, spoke volumes in the unforgiving world of royal optics. Because while Catherine's passion gave her life, it also left Edward standing alone in the harsh glare of royal duty. And that loneliness, his at the podium, hers at the piano, created a tension that would test their marriage in ways few ever realized. And that tension, as we'll see, would lead to whispers of strain, rumors of distance, and the question no one dared ask. Could love survive when duty and illness kept pulling them apart? Marriage in the royal family has always been a balancing act, a constant negotiation between private love and public duty. For the Duke and Duchess of Kent, that balancing act was more like a tightrope, stretched thin over decades of expectation, illness, and sacrifice. From the outside, their union looked stable. No scandals, no screaming headlines. No divorces played out on the front page like so many others in Windsor history. But inside, their marriage was tested in ways that only those who have lived it could ever truly understand. Let's set the scene. Edward, Duke of Kent, was the very definition of duty. His life was mapped out before him. State ceremonies, military obligations, countless public appearances alongside the Queen. He was not the flashiest royal, but he was reliable, always there, always steady, always loyal to the crown. Catherine, by contrast, was struggling. Depression shadowed her. Epstein-Barr drained her. Celiac disease cut her off from one of life's simplest pleasures. And then, on top of all that, she made the decision to step away from the spotlight. Duty and health, two forces pulling this couple in opposite directions. Now, imagine the optics. At events where other royals were flanked by smiling spouses, Edward often stood alone. Photographers noticed. The public whispered. Why wasn't the Duchess of Kent by his side? Was something wrong? Was the marriage strained? Those images of the Duke at ceremonies without his wife told a story the palace never confirmed, but everyone speculated about. And here's the heart of it. The strain wasn't born of betrayal or infidelity. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the cruel reality of two different lives colliding. Edward's life was public, ceremonial, relentless. Catherine's life became private, fragile, withdrawn. Can you picture that divide? Two people sharing the same home, the same marriage, but living in different worlds, one under the flashing cameras, the other hidden behind closed doors. For Edward, this must have been painful. To walk into Buckingham Palace, stand beside the Queen, smile for the cameras, and then return home to a wife battling despair and exhaustion. How many times did he wonder if he was doing enough? How many times did he feel torn, loyal to his sovereign, but aching to be loyal to his wife in a way that duty never allowed? For Catherine, the strain was different. She loved her husband, yes, but she must have felt guilt. Guilt for not being able to stand beside him. Guilt for withdrawing when the monarchy demanded her presence. Guilt for becoming, in the eyes of some, the invisible Duchess. Doesn't that guilt feel heavier when you remember her illnesses were never her choice? She wasn't absent because she wanted to be. She was absent because she had no choice. And yet, this dynamic carved deep lines in their marriage. At public events, Edward's solitude became symbolic. At private dinners, Catherine's illnesses dictated the rhythm. Slowly, they were pulled into roles neither had anticipated. Edward as the dutiful duke, Catherine as the reclusive duchess. Love remained, but duty and health pushed them further apart than anyone outside those palace walls could ever see. But here's the contradiction. Despite all this strain, their marriage endured. Unlike other royal unions that shattered under pressure, theirs bent but did not break. Why? Because Edward understood. He didn't see Catherine's withdrawal as rejection. He didn't resent her illnesses as burdens. He saw her humanity. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, and he remained by her side even when the rest of the world whispered doubts. That doesn't mean it was easy. There must have been moments of loneliness for him, standing alone at official ceremonies, wishing she was there. There must have been moments of despair for her, watching him leave for duty while she remained confined by illness. But they endured, and that endurance, that stubborn loyalty, is what makes their love story so remarkable. Let me ask you this. Would you have stayed? If your spouse could no longer join you in the life you were destined to lead, would you have carried on alone? Or would you have grown resentful, bitter, detached? Edward chose loyalty. Catherine chose humility. And together, those choices stitched their marriage together, even if imperfectly. The world may never fully know the sacrifices they made for each other. Catherine sacrificed her role as a public duchess. Edward sacrificed the companionship of a visible partner at his side. Both sacrificed pieces of themselves for the other. Doesn't that, in its own way, define love more than fairy tales ever could? Still, the strain took its toll, and Catherine, seeking solace, turned deeper into her faith. While Edward marched on with duty, Catherine found refuge in prayer, in spirituality, in the quiet strength of belief. Her faith became the anchor that kept her steady when her body failed and her mind faltered. But faith, while powerful, was no shield against the relentless march of time and illness. Because as her health declined further, their marriage would face yet another test, the slow, painful reality of aging and frailty. And it was in these twilight years, as Catherine's strength faded, that Edward's devotion would be tested one last time, in ways that would leave him whispering his heartbreaking goodbye. Oh God, why her? But before we reach that moment, we must understand the foundation of Catherine's resilience. And that foundation was not the crown, not the palace, not even the marriage. It was her faith. And it was this faith that would give her the strength to endure the final years of her life, even as everything else seemed to crumble around her. Faith. For Catherine, Duchess of Kent, it wasn't simply ritual. It wasn't just attending church on Sunday because she was royal, because the monarchy demanded it, or because appearances required it. Faith was survival. It was the anchor she clung to when depression dragged her down, when Epstein-Barr robbed her of her energy, when celiac disease turned every meal into a minefield, when loneliness pressed on her heart like a weight. Faith was not a crown or a duty. It was her refuge. But what made Catherine so different, so remarkable, was the way she chose to live that faith. She didn't perform it for cameras. She didn't wield it like a badge of piety. Instead, she practiced it quietly, humbly, almost anonymously. In a royal family obsessed with image, Catherine made faith something deeply personal. Doesn't that in itself feel like defiance? Let's remember something astonishing. Catherine converted to Catholicism in 1994. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? The British monarchy is bound to the Church of England. For centuries, Catholicism and the crown have been uneasy, even hostile companions. Royals were forbidden, by law, from marrying Catholics if they wished to remain in the line of succession. And yet Catherine, a duchess, cousin-in-law to the Queen herself, made the choice to embrace Catholicism. Quietly, without fanfare, without rebellion. She simply followed her heart, her belief, her truth. Now, pause for a moment. Can you imagine the courage that took? To look at centuries of royal tradition and quietly say, "This is not enough for me. I must follow my own path." She did not ask permission. She did not broadcast it to the press. She simply lived it. Doesn't that strike you as one of the boldest choices any Windsor-adjacent royal has ever made? Her conversion gave her something the palace could not: peace. It gave her a community outside of royal halls, outside of duty. It gave her a space where she was not a duchess, but just Catherine, a woman of faith-seeking comfort. And perhaps, it gave her absolution from the guilt she carried. Guilt for withdrawing from duty. Guilt for leaving Edward alone at public ceremonies. Guilt for illnesses she could not control. Faith, for Catherine, wasn't about rules. It was about release. And here's where the irony cuts deep. The royal family, as an institution, rarely speaks openly of faith beyond tradition. Christmas broadcasts, church services at Sandringham, weddings at Westminster Abbey. These are spectacles of religion, carefully staged for optics. Catherine's faith was different. It wasn't performance. It was intimacy. She wasn't trying to inspire the public. She was trying to survive. But doesn't that make her story even more relatable? Haven't we all, at some point, clung to something? Faith, hope, belief, when everything else around us fell apart. Catherine did exactly that. And in doing so, she revealed something the monarchy often hides: vulnerability. For Edward, her faith must have been both a comfort and a challenge. As Duke of Kent, he remained bound to the Church of England. His wife's Catholicism set them apart in a way that history would have once deemed scandalous. And yet, he supported her. He did not fight her choice. He did not condemn it. He accepted it as part of who she was. Isn't that, in itself, a testament to their bond? Catherine's quiet devotion extended beyond the pews. She found strength in small rituals, prayer, reflection, music as a form of worship. She became deeply involved in Catholic charities and education. And once again, she sought anonymity in this. She didn't wear her faith as a royal mission. She lived it as a personal calling. She blended into parish life, a duchess in name, but a believer in spirit, kneeling alongside ordinary people who had no idea who she was. And yet, even as her faith deepened, her body weakened. Depression still lurked. Epstein-Barr still drained her. Celiac still restricted her. Faith did not cure her, but it gave her something far more valuable: the will to endure. It gave her perspective, the knowledge that suffering was not meaningless, that life was more than duty, that peace could be found even in pain. Now, let's ask the question: did her faith make her stronger than other royals? Look at the history of the Windsor marriages: cracks, scandals, divorces, betrayals. Catherine and Edward endured. Not perfectly, not without strain, but they endured. Was it love alone that sustained them? Or was it Catherine's faith, her quiet resilience, her belief that none of us goes through life unscathed, but that scars can be carried with dignity. And yet, faith could not shield her from the final chapter. It could not prevent her frailty, her slow decline. It could not spare Edward from the sight of his beloved wife slipping further from him in her final years. But what it did give her, what it did give them both, was a kind of grace. A way to walk through the last stage of life not in bitterness, but in acceptance. But faith, as powerful as it was, could not silence the cruel reality of aging. Catherine's body, already battered by illness, began to give way. Her absences grew longer, her appearances fewer. The world forgot her, even as Edward's devotion never wavered. She had stepped out of the spotlight willingly, but in her final years, she was pulled even further into the shadows by frailty. And it was in those final years that the Duke's role shifted too. No longer just the dutiful cousin of the Queen, he became the devoted guardian of his wife. No cameras, no fanfare, no royal duties, just a husband keeping vigil. Because what came next, the Duchess in her final years, would be the most poignant and heartbreaking chapter of all. By the time Catherine reached her final years, the world had almost forgotten her. The tabloids no longer splashed her face across their pages, the cameras no longer fought for a glimpse of her at palace gates. Younger royals had taken center stage, Diana's tragic legend, Kate's polished rise, Meghan's storm of controversy. And yet, in the quiet corners of Windsor, in the shadows where the monarchy rarely looks, the Duchess of Kent lived out her last chapter. Frail, withdrawn, and yet, surrounded by a love that had never left her. Picture it. The once elegant Duchess who had walked beside her husband at grand ceremonies now spent her days at home, her strength dwindling. The illnesses that had marked her life, depression, Epstein-Barr, celiac, did not vanish with age. If anything, they compounded, leaving her weaker, more fragile, more dependent. Where once she had made the choice to step back from royal duties, now her body made the choice for her. The public saw only absence. Edward saw the truth, a woman fading before his eyes. And Edward, let's focus on him. By now he too was an old man. His hair gray, his face lined, his steps slower. But his devotion to Catherine never wavered. He had stood beside the Queen for decades, loyal in his duty. Yet it was at home, away from the world's gaze, that his truest duty lay. He became her protector, her comforter, her guardian. In those last years, when the palace halls must have felt colder than ever, Edward was her warmth. Doesn't that, in itself, redefine what loyalty means? Imagine the nights. The Duchess, restless with fatigue or pain, and the Duke keeping vigil beside her bed. Imagine the prayers whispered into the silence, his hand clasping hers as though to tether her to this world a little longer. Imagine the moments when she could no longer rise, no longer teach music, no longer engage with the faith that had sustained her, and yet Edward remained, steady, unflinching. A duke in name, but a husband in truth. And yet, the cruelty of it is this. Their bond, as strong as it was, could not hold back time. Catherine grew frilier. Appearances at family events all but ceased. Younger generations of royals married, had children, carried the Windsor name forward, while Catherine slipped into obscurity. How many times did she look at the world moving on and feel left behind? How many times did Edward stand at official ceremonies, his thoughts drifting back to the woman waiting for him at home, unseen, uncelebrated, but always at the center of his heart? The irony here is painful. Royals are supposed to live forever in memory, their every movement recorded in photographs and history books. But Catherine's last years were defined by invisibility. No fanfare, no attention, just quiet decline. And perhaps, in some ways, that was her choice. She had always preferred anonymity, humility, life away from the spotlight. But in other ways, it was tragedy. Because while the world forgot her, Edward never could. And then came the final months. Her health faltered further. The palace, as always, remained silent. The royal family doesn't announce every illness, every hospital visit, every moment of frailty. They preserve the mystique, the dignity. But behind those walls, the truth was unavoidable. Catherine was slipping away. The woman who had endured depression, fought Epstein-Barr, battled celiac, embraced faith, taught music, and lived humbly despite her crown. She was nearing the end. Can you imagine Edward's despair? a man in his late 80s, watching the partner of his life preparing to leave him. After decades of duty, after decades of sacrifice, after all the years of carrying on, what comfort could he possibly find in those moments? The monarchy offers no manual for grief. The palace offers no shield against heartbreak. For Edward, there was only Catherine, and the slow, unbearable knowledge that soon she would be gone. And yet, even in her frailty, Catherine left something behind. Her students remembered her. The charities she had quietly supported still carried her name. Her faith, lived humbly, continued to inspire those who knew her privately. And her marriage, imperfect, strained by duty and illness, but enduring, remained a testament to love that survives the unthinkable. But then, the inevitable came. The night when everything changed forever. Catherine's long battle with life's cruelties ended. And in that moment, Edward's world collapsed. The man who had stood so many times in silence, who had borne whispers and loneliness with dignity, finally broke. "Oh God, why her?" he whispered. Words that carried decades of grief, of loyalty, of helplessness. Words that revealed, in a single cry, the unbearable pain of losing the only person who had truly shared his hidden world. And yet, the story did not end there. Because the morning after her death, something happened that even those closest to the family could not have predicted. A moment of shock, of revelation, that left Edward reeling and the palace whispering. What was it? Because what came next would shake even the quiet dignity of the Duke of Kent and prove that Catherine